There is a plant Jesus used to heal the sick. You won't find it in a pharmacy. You won't find it in a prescription. But 4,000 years before modern medicine had a name for it, before Galen wrote a word, before Hippocrates drew breath, a people at the edge of the Judean desert were already using it every single day. And the Gospel of Mark tells us, in words that every Greek doctor of the first century would have recognized, that the disciples used it to heal the sick. There are 5 of these plants, 5 that his world used for healing, and in some cases, 5 that Jesus or his disciples are recorded using directly. For each one, modern pharmacology has uncovered what the ancients seem to have known intuitively. Some of the science is new, published in the last 3 years. Some of the compounds are older than the Bible. All of them are real. And the first one is what the disciples rubbed onto sick bodies 2,000 years ago, while the Romans were writing field medicine manuals that said to do exactly the same thing. The word the Gospel uses is aleiphontes, anointed, but not the way you're thinking. There are 2 Greek words for anointing in the New Testament, and they do different work. One of them is chriō, the word for sacred anointing, pouring oil as a ritual, marking a king. It's the word at the root of Christ itself. The other word is aleipho, smear, rub, massage. It's the vocabulary of Greek medical manuals. The word Galen uses when he tells physicians to apply a salve. The word Hippocrates used for therapeutic anointing. 2 centuries of doctors writing the same word, meaning exactly the same thing, medicine applied to a body. And in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verse 13, when the disciples are sent out and heal many, the word Mark chose was aleiphontes, not ceremony, not symbol, medicine. So what were they rubbing into the sick? Olive oil. In 1st century Judea, olive oil was what you had. The Philistine city of Tel Mikna Ekron, during its peak centuries, ran over 100 industrial olive presses simultaneously. Entire buildings dedicated to pressing fruit into oil. It was food, it was lamplight, it was cosmetic, and it was medicine. The base into which every other remedy was mixed. Roman doctors, not Jewish prophets, prescribed the same thing. Celsus, the encyclopedist writing around the year 50, in Rome, lists olive oil as the standard emollient for burns, ulcerations, and wound dressings. His treatment for a beaten traveler in his medical text reads almost verbatim like the parable of the Good Samaritan. Pour oil and wine on the wound, bind it, carry the man to shelter. It looked for centuries like coincidence, an ancient remedy that happens to soothe. Nothing deeper there. Then in 2005, a paper landed in Nature. A chemistry team led by Gary Beauchamp isolated a molecule in extra virgin olive oil called oleocanthal. And what oleocanthal does is inhibit the same 2 enzymes, cyclooxygenase 1 and cyclooxygenase 2, that ibuprofen inhibits. Anti-inflammatory, natural analgesic, a painkiller pressed out of a fruit. The sharp sting you feel at the back of your throat when you drink fresh, extra virgin olive oil? That is the molecule firing. That sensation is chemically identical to a mild dose of ibuprofen. And this isn't a one-paper fluke. A randomized controlled trial in 2022 in the journal Diabetes and Metabolic Syndrome showed topical olive oil accelerating healing in grade 1 and grade 2 diabetic foot ulcers. Same oil, same treatment. 4,000 years later, the disciples didn't know there was a molecule called oleocanthal, but they knew what this oil did on a wound. And Mark didn't write that they blessed the sick with oil. he wrote that they smeared them with it. Oil for healing. But not every plant in the Gospels heals. Some purify. When David cried out for cleansing in Psalm 51, he named one plant. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. When the Israelites marked their doors in Exodus 12, it was hyssop they dipped into the blood. And when John tells us at the climax of his gospel that the last liquid Jesus received before he died was lifted on a sponge, the sponge was pressed against the end of a hyssop branch. Hyssop runs through the Bible like a thread. And for most of church history, we didn't even know what it was. There's a problem. The plant that English Bibles call hyssop, the one Linnaeus named Hyssopus officinalis in 1753, doesn't grow in Israel. It's native to southern Europe. It wouldn't have been on Mount Gerizim, or in the hills outside Jerusalem, or in any doorway in 1st century Galilee, which means whatever the original Hebrew word azov refers to, it isn't our hyssop. 3 plants are candidates. Most modern scholars argue for Oreganum syriacum, Syrian oregano, what Middle Eastern cooks today call za'atar. Sturdy stems, aromatic leaves, grows wild across the Levantine hills. Medieval Jewish scholars, Maimonides in the 12th century, Saadia Gaon before him, identified azov with exactly this plant. Its stems hold water for sprinkling rituals, as Exodus requires. Its leaves release aromatic oil under pressure, and crucially, it contains a compound called carvacrol. Carvacrol is one of the most thoroughly studied natural antimicrobials in the modern literature. It physically disrupts bacterial cell membranes. It inhibits ATPase activity, meaning the bacterial cell can't produce energy. It kills Staphylococcus aureus, Escherichia coli, and several species of Candida, all at concentrations you could achieve by crushing a handful of Syrian oregano leaves into water, which is, roughly, what the purification rites describe. And then there's John chapter 19, verse 29. The soldiers offered Jesus a sponge of sour wine, lifted on a stalk of hyssop, a detail so strange that some commentators suspected the author of inventing it for symbolism. How do you lift a sponge 4 feet on a stalk of hyssop? The European plant isn't strong enough. The stems are too soft. But if biblical hyssop is Oreganum syriacum, and the Samaritans on Mount Gerizim, who have been in the same place for 2,500 years, still gather it in bundles for their own purification rites, then you have a branch stiff enough to hold a sponge, aromatic enough to register in a half-conscious man's senses, and soaked in a plant whose compounds we now know would have disinfected the sponge on contact. Every detail the gospel remembers, the plant delivers. Olive oil to heal, hyssop to purify. But one of the most striking medical episodes in the whole Bible isn't in the New Testament at all. It's in a prophet's house 700 years before Jesus was born. King Hezekiah was dying. The account is in Isaiah 38 and again in 2 Kings 20. A boil. The Hebrew word is shekin, used for severe skin abscesses, probably what we would today call a staphylococcal furuncle. Untreated in the 8th century BC, this kills you. The prophet Isaiah walks into the king's room and tells him he will not recover. And then Isaiah changes his mind. He gives the king something. He says, "Take a lump of figs and apply it to the boil." That's the entire prescription. The Hebrew phrase is debele te'anim, a cake of pressed figs. The king's servants crush the fruit, press the mass against the infection, bind it, and Hezekiah recovers. For centuries, this was treated as either metaphor or miracle. The prophet healed the king. The figs were incidental. A nice detail in a story about divine intervention. Physin is an enzyme in the white latex of fig trees, the sap that bleeds when you break a fig branch. It's a cysteine protease, which is a specific kind of molecular scissor that cuts proteins apart. And what it cuts, a 2017 paper in Scientific Reports demonstrated, is the protective biofilm that Staphylococcus and Streptococcus bacteria build around their colonies. A mature staph abscess isn't defeated by antibodies alone. The bacteria wrap themselves in a biological shield, layers of extracellular polymeric substances that block immune cells from reaching them. This is why some infections are so hard to clear. The antibody can't get through the armor. Physin dissolves the armor. Once the biofilm is gone, the immune system reaches the bacteria and finishes the work. Isaiah prescribed a biofilm-dissolving enzyme nearly 3,000 years before we knew biofilms existed. Roman doctors, reading the same Greek medical tradition the prophets inherited, wrote down the same prescription in different words. Celsus, in Book 5 of De Medicina, recommends crushed figs mixed with barley flour for severe burns, infected sores, and necrotic flesh. Same mechanism, same family of wounds, different language. The ancient Mediterranean world had, in effect, a shared pharmaceutical textbook, and the fig was in it. A fig on a boil to break a biofilm, a herb in a sponge to disinfect a wound. These are not metaphors. But the next plant in this list isn't a medicine the ancients used well. It's a medicine Jesus refused. There is a plant that appears 3 times in the story of Jesus' life. Once at the beginning, once at the end, and once in the moments between. At the beginning, the Magi bring it as one of 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Matthew doesn't explain the choice, he just names them. At the end, in John 19, verse 39, Nicodemus carries it to the tomb. 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes wrapped with Jesus' body in linen strips. It's the burial of a king. And in between, in Mark chapter 15, verse 23, minutes before the crucifixion, they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. In Christian tradition, we often read that passage as Jesus refusing comfort, choosing to suffer fully. And that's true. But what he was refusing wasn't symbolic. Myrrh is a resin, dried sap from trees of the genus Commiphora, native to Arabia and the Horn of Africa. In the 1st century, it was one of the most expensive commodities in the Mediterranean world, a trade good carried by camel caravan along the incense road, stored in sealed alabaster jars like the ones archaeologists have pulled from tombs in the Negev. It was perfume, preservative, and medicine. Specifically, it was an analgesic. Dioscorides, in Book 1 of his Materia Medica, writes that an extract called stacte, fresh myrrh pressed with water, is capable of inducing deep sleep and soothing violent pain. Pliny the Elder, writing separately, says that myrrh mixed with wine soothes agony. Celsus prescribes myrrh pills explicitly to procure sleep and relieve acute internal pain. And the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate Sanhedrin 43a, records that aristocratic women of Jerusalem prepared exactly this mixture, wine laced with myrrh, for condemned men before their executions. The purpose was to dull the senses of the dying, to blunt the pain of what was about to happen. That is what was offered to Jesus on the cross. Modern pharmacology has since identified the compound doing the work. It's called furanodiene, a sesquiterpene, and it binds directly to opioid receptors in the central nervous system. A 2011 study in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology confirmed this by blocking the effect with naloxone, the drug used in emergency rooms today to reverse opioid overdoses. The block worked. Myrrh, dissolved in wine, is a crude opiate. Jesus was offered a first-century narcotic, and he refused it. The Hebrew root of the word myrrh, mor, literally means bitter, the plant of grief. He was offered at his birth what his death would require, and he chose, at the last, to face that death with his mind clear, which makes the next plant one of the strangest passages in the Gospels. It was the final liquid he took minutes before he died. 7 verses later, in John 19, verse 29, the soldiers lift a second sponge, soaked in a different liquid, pressed to his lips. And the Greek text is precise. It isn't the same word Mark used for the myrrh wine. Mark wrote oinos. That is the standard Greek word for wine, the drink of banquets, the drink of the Last Supper, the drink laced with myrrh that Jesus refused. John wrote oxos, different word, different drink. Oxos was what Roman soldiers drank on duty. The Latin was posca, watered-down vinegar, heavily diluted, sharp with acidity, the low wine a legionary carried in a field canteen. Not a pleasure drink, a hydration ration. And the reason it worked as a hydration ration in a world without water treatment is that its acidity and low-grade alcohol content killed most waterborne bacteria. Roman soldiers drank oxos because it was safer than the local well water. Quite literally. So this is what you actually see at the foot of the cross, a jar of Roman field hydration, stale, acidic, probably half concentrated in the heat of a Jerusalem afternoon. The soldiers dip a sponge. They lift it on the stalk of Syrian oregano. And Jesus, who had refused the narcotic hours before, accepts this. He took enough to speak. It is finished. And then he died. Wine itself, in the ancient world, was medicine. Paul tells Timothy in his first letter to stop drinking only water and to take a little wine for his stomach and for his frequent ailments. That is a medical prescription in a pastoral letter. The Good Samaritan pours wine into a wounded man's injuries before he pours oil. Celsus recommends wine as the primary wound wash throughout his surgical manuals. The Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Bava Batra 58b, records wine speaking in its own voice. I am the head of all cures. Modern chemistry has since explained the mechanism. Wine's combination of low pH, ethanol content, and plant polyphenols kills pathogenic bacteria. A 2012 review in Current Opinion in Biotechnology demonstrated that this activity extends even to multi-drug resistant strains that modern antibiotics struggle with. Wine as antiseptic is not superstition, it is correct. What gets lost if we read these passages as theology alone is that the writers of the Gospels knew this. They lived in a world where wine was how you treated a wound. And when they chose their words precisely, oinos for the cup he refused, oxos for the ration he accepted, they were communicating something specific. He rejected what would numb his mind. He accepted what would wet his throat. These are the plants: olive oil in a disciple's hand, hyssop at Passover's threshold, fig on a king's boil, myrrh in a bitter cup, wine in a soldier's canteen. And here is what I want to tell you last. In 2024, a team of researchers at Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem published a paper in the journal Communications Biology. They had, years earlier, taken a seed out of a cave in the Judean desert, a seed discovered by archaeologists in the 1980s. Radiocarbon dating placed the seed at roughly 1,000 years old. Species unknown. They planted it. 14 years later, the tree they grew, which they named Sheba, was tall enough, healthy enough, and resinous enough to sequence. DNA analysis placed it in the genus Commiphora, a relative of Myrrh, not identical to any living species on Earth, possibly a cultivar native to the Judean desert, extinct from modern botany, but described, the researchers believe, in the Hebrew Bible under the name Tsori, the balm of Gilead, a tree the prophet Jeremiah wrote about. Is there no balm in Gilead, resurrected from a seed, growing in Israel? Right now, you can see photographs of it. First new growth, green leaves, a slender trunk, an extinct biblical plant germinating in a greenhouse 1,000 years after its last living ancestor. For 2,000 years, we treated these stories as stories about faith, and they are. But they were also stories about people. People who knew their soil, their plants, their bodies, and the quiet relationships between them. People who pressed olives and burned frankincense and rolled myrrh in cloth for the dead. People who looked at a boil and knew, for reasons they could not name, that a fig would draw it out. People whose medicine we forgot, and whose faith we kept. Somewhere between then and now, we lost the plants. The seed is already growing. Perhaps it is time to sit down at their table again. If you'd like to spend more time at that table, subscribe. We'll be doing more of these, 1 week at a time.